My name is Dave Wilson. I'm a member of the People for Effective Government, or PEG. So first of all, again, thank you for coming tonight, especially on such a good weather night. It's hard to pull yourself away from doing stuff outside, but so we appreciate you doing that. I'd like to just take a couple minutes to put in a plug for PEG. PEG is a Spokane-based nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. PEG's mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible and ensure an adequate social safety net and promotes a civil society. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. If you are interested in learning more about PEG or becoming a member, when Mike finishes speaking, I'm going to talk a little bit more about PEG and ask you to stick around for 4 or 5 minutes after Mike finishes so you can learn more about PEG. I do have the pleasure tonight of introducing our speaker, Mike Petersen. The members of PEG asked Mike to speak tonight because we believe deeply in environmental stewardship. We believe that clean air, clean water, and protection of the ecology is not only an environmental issue, it's a moral issue that affects not only us, but future generations. Mike Petersen has worked at the Lands Council for over 25 years, 17 years as the executive director. He was born in Colorado and grew up in the Denver area. He has a master's of science in mechanical engineering from Colorado State. Mike met environmentalist Edward Abbey and was inspired to become an environmental activist. Mike will describe how he took part in direct actions such as Redwood Summer blockades and tree sits, and how he sustained the passion for the last 4 decades. He will also talk about tactics ranging from direct action and litigation to negotiation and collaboration. He will speak to the role that the Lands Council had in forest collaborations and took part in the innovative A to Z project on the Colville National Forest. Mike now works in 4 collaborative groups on 3 national forests, the Colville, the Kootenai, and the Idaho Panhandle. And Mike is also a member of the Spokane River Regional Toxic Task Force. Try saying that fast 3 times. He was recently appointed to the Spokane Sustainability Action Subcommittee. He serves on the board of Farm Power, a project that utilizes crop residue, and he co-hosts Earth Matters Now on KYRS Thin Air Community Radio Spokane. Welcome, Mike Petersen.
Yeah, I echo. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight when you could be gardening or sitting on the patio having a glass of wine or a beer or something like that. So thank you very much for coming out. Well, I'm going to talk about some of the, actually some of them were illegal things I did as I was becoming an activist, but I want to first start talking about what motivated me. And I think, make sure it's up there, some of you may remember this from the early 70s, and this kind of sparked me and I think a lot of people of that era to start thinking about pollution and garbage. And it was an Indian who was canoeing across this area and came upon all this trash. And there was a couple ironies. The guy really wasn't an Indian, he was Irish. But it was a great tear, and it got a lot of us thinking about pollution, and I think it helped spawn the idea of Earth Day and all that. And it certainly helped motivate me, and I was in high school at that time. Another action that really motivated me was I had a great biology teacher, Dr. Bolin, and we got to do an experiment. And so my friend and I we had motorcycles, and we got up there and drove all the way from the headwaters of the South Platte River, which is in Colorado, and we took water samples. And no surprise, as we got closer and closer to Denver, the samples were murkier and murkier, and we tested, I think, for coliform and higher levels of coliform. That really instilled in me, too, the idea of working on rivers and the idea that things don't immediately get polluted. They get polluted from 1,000 places sometimes, and I would say Hangman Creek is a little bit like that as well. And then I did 4 years in the Navy, and even back then, that's a picture of the Kanto Plain where Tokyo is. Even back then, there was over 50 million people just in the Kanto Plain, and we were on a small security base about 20 miles from downtown Tokyo, I would say. And it was just not only traffic jams, so you'd take subways, but we went mountain climbing, and on the top of every mountain, right below the top, would be a big pile of trash. People would just take their stuff up there and eat and just throw their stuff in this big pile, and that irritated me quite a bit. So it made me want to start doing something, and then you start saying, what are we going to do? Well, one person that motivated me pretty seriously was Edward Abbey. I got involved with a gang of people who were called radical environmentalists, and we were Earth Firsters. And so I was involved in the very early days of Earth First. And Edward Abbey was an inspiration in a way for Earth First. He wrote the book, The Monkey Wrench Gang. And have any of you read that book? A few of you have. Pretty fun gang. You know, these guys went around and cut down billboards and you know, painted a stripe or something on a dam and all that kind of stuff. But that really inspired all of us at Earth First to take some what we called direct action. And Earth First meant early on, we got really involved in forestry issues, and we got involved in some other things. And a few people got arrested, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two. But I got to meet Edward Abbey. I was still going to school, and this flyer, it's hard to read it, I know, but I was a mechanical engineering student and a grad student, actually. And so we had this table that I basically reserved in the student union, and we were having these discussions with certain professors in the forestry department, but it was sponsored by the Department of Mechanical Engineering because that's the body that I worked under at that time. Anyway, Edward Abbey came to town, and he came to speak at the thing, and so I set up a little table right in front of the auditorium, and he comes by and he goes, "Oh, way to take advantage of me being here." We shook hands, and I met him a couple other times, once at our Earth First Round River Rendezvous. That was kind of the annual rendezvous. And I met him there, and he was discussing things with some folks. He was actually a really nice guy and very mellow, and people would try to get in his face, and he'd just kind of stand back a little bit, and very gentlemanly person. And his writing, just from Desert Solitaire to Monkey Wrench Gang to all sorts of, you know, very beautiful prose and poetry, was just very inspirational, and it really inspired a lot of us. So, as Earth First, you kind of felt like you were going to save the world, right? So one of the things that came up in '87, I think it was Paul Watson, who started Sea Shepherd. He put this article in the Earth First Journal, and it was all about, come up and stop the wolf kill. Wolves are dying up in northern British Columbia, and it was a call for people. And so two groups of us, one group from Missoula, a group from the kind of Spokane, Bellingham, went up there in February of 1988, and that was the year that Calgary had the Olympics. I remember that very well. And we were kind of like, we're going to stop this aerial wolf kill. And we camped out, and it got 25, 30 below zero, windy, and we had banners on the highway, and you know, and we're just, hey, and we occupied the office of the wildlife department up there, and we had got some good media, and some women parachuted into a site. I mean, it was a big deal. We went down to Vancouver and had raised a little heck down there. But anyway, we're up there, and there were some good stories. One truck driver goes by, and they'd all honk their horn in the middle of the night because they knew we were there, like, wake them up, you know. This one guy goes, "Hey, you gonna come back in June to save the mosquitoes?" You know, and that was kind of the idea that they had about wolves there. Well, they did stop the aerial wolf hunt, and it did end, and it ended for quite a few years, and only very recently, and there was a story that was in the Earth First Journal talking about how we had stopped the aerial hunt, which felt pretty darn good, I gotta tell you. And the last night I was there, it was amazing. There's only like 4 of us left, and we're just sitting there camped out, and it's bitter cold, but the aurora borealis came up, and there was this spiral up there in the sky, and then it started spinning. We're just going, wow, this is like a sign from somebody. This is pretty cool. So that felt really good. Well, wolves have remained a big issue, of course, throughout the West, including Washington State. Just this past year, again, British Columbia is going to try and kill wolves by air. But it doesn't happen just in British Columbia. It happens in Idaho, it happens in Washington State, and my coworker, Chris Bachman from the Lands Council, works on the wolf issue. And we are still trying to stop aerial wolf kills. And the reason they kill them in Washington State is cows, quite frankly. And back in the day, we had this campaign. It was called Cattle Free by '93. And that was going to be on public lands. Because there's such a conflict between cattle and what they do on public lands, we thought, well, we'll just have this campaign. Well, how many years ago was that? And they're still up on public land. So some campaigns are not always successful. And some take a long, long time to manifest themselves. This is kind of funny. You guys might remember Cliven Bundy. He's the guy who's been ranching down there near Mesquite, Nevada, and the Gold Butte National Monument forever, and he never pays his grazing fees. The grazing fees are pretty cheap anyway. They're like $1.35 for a cow-calf per month. He's refused to pay them. The feds have tried to kick him off, arrest him. He's still going through court issues. Even recently, they're still trying to go after him, but he's just abusing public land, in my opinion. So, what do we do on the Colville? We've decided we're going to try to work with some of the ranchers who are open and don't necessarily dislike wolves. They just don't like their cows getting killed by wolves. And Chris and I came up kind of with this idea of open meadows. When you think of our Colville and a lot of our national forests here in the West, they actually used to be a lot more open. And we've been really good at putting out fires, and we've been logging some of them, and all that has brought in a lot denser, smaller, younger trees. And so the open forest is no longer. Meadows have shrunk in. I've heard just a few weeks ago that we are 98% effective at putting out forest fires. So when you do that, there's consequences. And I'll talk a bit more about forest fires, but I just wanted to say, our proactive idea is to work with, and there's some ranchers up there who want to work with us. Chris and I were just at a Colville Forest, what they called a resolution meeting, and one-on-one, some of the ranchers would come up and say, we want to work with you, come up and visit us, let's see if we can figure something out. Because they don't necessarily like all the conflict, and who wants to see wolves killed, who wants to see cows getting killed up there? Neither one, so we'll try to work something out. So I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit, because one of the big campaigns was, going back to the 80s again, was one thing that got the Lands Council started was all the logging and road building that went on our forests around here, particularly the Idaho Panhandle National Forest, which those are pictures from the Idaho Panhandle, giant clear cuts. They at one point had the highest road density, over 13 miles of road per square mile. I mean, think about that. That's like a subdivision or something. And the roads did things like wash out and create lots of problems, put mud in the rivers, degrade the habitat. Fish don't do too well in this sort of situation. And so we got on the Forest Service and we learned how to challenge projects, appeal timber sales so that we could slow things down. And the Lands Council actually started a Forest Watch program that that was replicated around the country. And that was our tactic at that time. Teach citizens how to go out and monitor timber sales. My first job was monitoring timber sales on 8 national forests around here. And we we were very effective at it. We slowed the cut by about 80%, actually. And that didn't make us a lot of friends, of course, in the timber industry. But it sure did keep the old growth from getting cut, and it kept them out of roadless areas, which at that time were shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So we marched ahead on that. And then we would make posters and stick them up in Forest Service offices and kind of poke fun at the Forest Service of their mission of really logging. And they were very much pressured to do a lot of commercial logging, and the politics were in their favor. And so the tactic at that point was, we're going to do the, ways to stop timber sales that we can. And then we started thinking about other methods. This is kind of an Earth First poster from way back, just kind of, yeah, we're tough and we can fix it all and all that. And we were. We had a real attitude. There's no doubt about it. We had such an attitude about things. So there was a tactic that started spreading around Earth First called tree sitting. And I was involved in one on the Colville National Forest. And we had some, police, threats of arrest and all that, people around the country doing it on the same day. And the tactic there was elevate the public issue of logging, over-logging of our national forest, and start getting legislators on our side. And we had one legislator, Cynthia McKinney, who introduced a bill to end logging on our public lands, end commercial logging. So those were the really heady days of Earth First in the late 80s, early 90s. And I started working at a food co-op. I was co-manager in Republic, and I was working like 3 days a week, and then I kept having cut back, and soon I was only working 1 day a week because I was so active doing Earth First stuff, and no one was paying me. I was sort of just going through my savings, which is not completely sustainable. So we actually, in 1988, myself and Tim and Sue Coleman, put on a Round River Rendezvous right near here. And these were national, conferences, but they weren't conferences. They were always outside, and people would learn tactics. And so we put it on up in the Colville National Forest. And one of the interesting things was, and I think it might be, it's not on these slides, but one of the people who was there, and I'll say the word monkey wrenching, because that was also a component of what some Earth Firsters did. They'd go and wreck bulldozers or spike trees, that sort of stuff. Well, one of the instructors at one of the workshops there, and they were informal workshops, turned out was an FBI agent. He was teaching diesel mechanics. So the FBI had gotten very interested in Earth First. And I don't know who it was, I never found out, but I lived in a cabin out in the woods, and I went out one night, and it was very late and dark, and I smelled cigarette smoke. And there was no one that lived anywhere near, and I knew somebody was probably watching over me. Maybe that was paranoia, but I wouldn't have smelled that cigarette smoke. So we were kind of in the spotlight as real troublemakers. And one of the things that we did was occupy Forest Service offices. So on the Okanagan, right after this Round River Rendezvous, which was on the Colville, we drove over the Okanagan, we occupied their office, stood on the roof, and I was one of the 26 who got arrested. And it was basically to call attention, get media, and shut down the logging, or at least the administrative part of the logging, for a day or so. So, spent just a little bit of time in jail. We did a whole bunch of demos. I did one on the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which is down by Vancouver, Washington. Did one on the Colville, and this was more of an interesting one because we'd been handing them appeals for a couple years, and that's me in that Earth First t-shirt there, back when I had dark hair and longer hair, I guess. And then my mother's actually in that picture. She's on the left over there. My mom was always very supportive. They had moved, my mom and dad had moved to Republic, and she loved to go out and do demos with us, which is pretty cool to have your mom out there supporting you. Other tactics. This was the Cove Mallard area. It was a proposed roadless sale, and the idea was to blockade roads by by building these tripods, have people hang from the tripods, just to shut down the logging practices as much as possible. Put blockades of sticks in the roads, so they'd have to clear it out. And the idea is slow these projects down. Maybe you're waiting for a court injunction. Maybe you're just hoping you'll slow them down or they'll give up. Most of Cove Mallard never got logged and they did not build roads through most of it. There was some road building. So a lot of that actually worked by people getting out on the ground, whole bunches of arrest. But it was an amazing action. Well, that led to, in 1990, Redwood Summer. And that was a pretty big thing because here was a chunk of land owned by Pacific Lumber, but it was purchased by a private individual who decided Pacific Lumber had been logging some, but they've been leaving the big old groves of redwood trees. Well, when Charles Hurwitz bought it, he also bought KYRS, by the way, same guy. And his plan, like some corporations, is to just maximize profit and cut every tree down that he could. And so this began a big campaign on a private chunk of forest. And so anything we did there, you get caught, you're going to jail because you're trespassing, basically. So I spent about half of the summer in 1990 there, and I learned this place pretty well. One of our inspirations was Judy Berry, who later had a bomb go off under her seat in a car and almost died from it. But she was an inspiration. She lived down there and she'd rally the troops and all that. And those were kind of our heroes, you know, people who just full-time were working to stop things. She was also a union organizer, and so she worked with KYRS people too. The employees at KYRS were also getting hurt by this Charles Hurwitz guy who was cutting wages, making it more dangerous to work there. So we had this big campaign, reclaiming the redwoods, and kind of one of the culminations was to have this mass arrest in the redwoods right toward the end of August to capture, national attention. And my role in that, I had been out there for weeks and weeks. I was sort of like a tour guide for the redwoods. I knew that place inside and out. We had a small group of us who knew it really well. And by day, we'd just camp out on the beach near Arcata. And by night, we would roam the woods. There might be some thought that we put up some timber blockades, but I won't talk too much more about that. So that was my map. I had a topo map so I could show everybody exactly where to go. And the day of the night before the big blockade, it was just fascinating because we had hundreds of people kind of hiding in the woods. We had let them in there, and they were going to occupy this grove that was being logged. And I got to say, seeing some of those trees cut down was just heart-wrenching. I mean, these are hundreds of year old giant redwoods they were sawing down in 1990. So we'd show people where to go, we'd lead them into the grove, and then the next day, everyone's standing in the grove, the police, and they deputized all the timber workers. It was quite a scene. My role was to get away and help people another day, so I was able to outrun some police and then meet up with my rendezvous point, and it was just fascinating to see everyone just putting their heart on the line. And it didn't end at that, because what happened was that did create a lot of pressure. It created pressure with the state legislature, who finally found the money and bought that grove. And so most of those trees are still standing today. So it was kind of a way of delaying what was going on out there. Okay, so now I'm gonna, switch to the part B.
I feel like the man behind the curtain now.
So one of the things that happened, which I forgot to mention, I grew up in Denver, and we did a demonstration at a livestock show. And the livestock show goes through Denver every year, I think in May or June. And we hung this banner, "Get livestock off public lands." And it was two people hung from the banner over 16th Street, if you've ever been to Denver. And then we had two people on either side of the rope hanging, kind of guarding it. Well, this guy who didn't know who we were, but he was a building guy, he comes out with his giant pair of scissors, and we had to wrestle with this guy to keep him from cutting the rope, which probably would have killed. And so we all got arrested for that, but the police arrested that guy as well, and we got released fairly soon after that. But there were some tense moments, in that situation. So the Lands Council, which was formerly called the Inland Empire Public Lands Council, we were pretty hardcore in those days. We challenged timber sales, we poked fun, we called, the Forest Service would say, oh, there's a forest health crisis, we gotta do something about it, and we'd call them on that. And so John Osborne, who helped found the Lands Council, published Transitions, so that was always a great rally. Also went to, when President Clinton did the Northwest Forest Plan, he came to Portland, and we went down there. And this was maybe a turning point, because my buddy and I went in his Forest Service office where they processed the appeals we did. And we go and meet these people, and they're nice people, and we're having a great conversation. And they're going, God, you guys are really nice. And we say, well, we appeal some stuff. And he goes, boy, we get some crazy appeals. And this woman pulls out this appeal of a mining claim that I had written. And I was very accusatory in it, and toward the Forest Service, but I didn't know this woman before that. And so it really made me think, how do you best communicate with people? Obviously, I hadn't communicated very well with her, but in person, we could hit it off and have a lot in common. So those are things that kind of would, change the way I thought. So Dave talked about the tactics, and I want to spend a moment talking about that, because there's ways that you can change the world, if you will. And I think of this in terms of climate change or any kind of emerging issue. And in those days of forest, you have demonstrations, you have blockades, we have schools, we have strikes now, monkey wrenching. You can do it with art and theater. You can occupy offices. You can boycott things. You can write letters, legislation, litigation, collaboration. And so I believe that there's a time for all of those. And if you have an emerging issue, collaboration probably won't work. You got to come to a table to collaborate more as an equal partner, I believe. And so you probably have to do a bunch of those other things first. And so I really respect the work of Greta Thunberg with the, taking on the climate strikes and all that, because she sees this as a crisis, and it is. And she's saying we need to step up and do things, because writing letters hasn't worked, collaborating hasn't really worked. So everything has its time, I believe. So along those lines, during the lead up to the '92 primary, I ended up meeting up with David Brower. We had a conference in Des Moines, Iowa, and it was kind of primary season. And he was a great leader. He had belonged to the Sierra Club, but they weren't radical enough for him, and so he formed Friends of the Earth. And he was also just a brilliant and just amazing person who had a lot of vision. He fought the dams in the Grand Canyon, and I had such an honor to meet with him and share a glass of wine with him one day and just talk about it, because at that time, there was a group called the National Forest Protection Alliance, and we were a group that said no logging on public lands. And I turned out to be the president for a while. And so I got a chance to meet this guy and talk about an inspirational person. This guy had stopped, amazing amount of dams that were going to be built right in the Grand Canyon through a lot of perseverance, lawsuits, and congressional action ultimately. So I mentioned the National Forest Protection Alliance. And it was very political amongst conservation groups. Sierra Club, because of almost a coup within the club, endorsed it, but then their staff never actually worked on it. And the bill in Congress by Cynthia McKinney was introduced, had 100 representatives, never got introduced into the Senate, and it eventually kind of fizzled away. So later on, we had a story on last June by a guy from the Alliance for Wild Rockies board saying, oh, that was just an illusion campaign. The Landsborough Rockies is sort of a radical group now, and they have an allusional campaign too to Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which would do all these things, but it never goes anywhere. And so you got to weigh how much time you spend on something that's visionary but won't go anywhere versus getting stuff accomplished on the ground. Lands Council endorsed zero cut, and I got to work on it. And so now, though, we've dropped that, and we're working in 4 forest collaborations. So the question is, why is that? And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the A to Z project up on the Colville National Forest. I'm going to spend some time at the end to talk about those forest collaborations. But linked into all of this is what I call the water issue. And so we're going to reel back to the 80s again when the Lands Council got formed because the Coeur d'Alene Basin was flooding with mud and dirt and mining waste. And so the Lands Council took on the clear cutting and the road building, but we also took on the Superfund site. And sooner or later, we got a Superfund site designation. Today, we are still battling it though, because there's still millions of sediment, metals-laden sediment at the bottom of that lake that have to be dealt with. Some problems take a long time to reserve. So I want to tell a fun little story about a recycling party we did. And this is a true story. Back in 1990, there was an Earth Day party that we declared that the Spokesman Review was going to start recycling newsprint. We sent things to organizations and churches and businesses saying, thank the Spokesman Review by coming to they're inviting us to their store or their printing mill on Earth Day and bring all your newspaper. Well, we had flyers. We were advertising people to come. 4 days before Earth Day, the spokesman, which really did us a big favor, puts out an article, Recycling Party is a Hoax. And we're not really doing this. We don't know who did this, and we're definitely not. But of course, we're thinking about recycling paper. And then I got a letter from, I think that was from Sean Higgins, who was an editorial staff guy. And he thanked us kind of for raising the issue and being polite about it. And we went out there on Earth Day, and Earthworks, Jim Schrock, provided a whole bunch of newspaper, and we dumped off all these paper. We called all the TV stations. They all came out, covered it on the news. Media is always an important thing. But the best part is, a couple weeks after we did this, they announced we are going to open a de-inking plant. And I had one of the reporters tell me they never would have done that if you hadn't have had your fake recycling party. So fake news did work in this case. The irony, though, and there's some irony here. Dave mentioned I'm on the Spokane River Toxics Task Force, and we're on there with Inland Empire Paper. Well, because they recycle newsprint, both the black ink and the colored ink have PCBs in them. And so now there's PCBs in their waste stream that all of us are having to deal with. So there's always a law of unintended consequences. You do something and you think you've saved the world or a part of the world, but we are working together very collaboratively to solve this problem. In fact, Spokane has become the hotbed of dealing with PCBs. The Lands Council has a Spokane River Toxics Task Force. And we've got some notoriety. The Lands Council has a project to have fungi that break down PCBs, working with North Central High School. And so that Toxics Task Force is doing some great things at identifying, and turns out there's PCBs in titanium dioxide. That's in a lot of things like sunscreen, but even some food. We even have the titanium dioxide people fly to our meetings because they're all nervous that they're gonna get shut out of the conversation. So when you collaborate, you bring in all these other people start paying attention. And so the state legislature, again, funded the Toxics Task Force because we have a lot of science we do and workshops and all that. So we're going to get the PCBs down. We're on the hotbed around the country of dealing with PCBs, and we're doing it collaboratively, which I think is pretty cool. So I'm going to wrap up my last little episode of energy and climate change. Another time I got arrested, we did a blockade of a uranium mine on the Grand Canyon, and it's an operating uranium mine at that time. And spent 4 days in jail in Flagstaff, which is not the best place to spend 4 days in jail, but it was fun. And we shut it down for a few hours. But eventually, there was a law passed which prohibited any new mining on the Grand Canyon until, I think, 2022. That is up right now, and it's political. And I think we need a change of administration in order to actually prohibit mining along the Grand Canyon. The tribes down there are nervous because the Grand Canyon water structure is such that you start exposing all those minerals, it can seep down into their water table and cause permanent problem. So as a culture, we have to decide, I think, and there's a group called Mothers for Nuclear. You know, we want nuclear power. So I think as a culture, we have to decide where our energy future is going to go. I happen to think the costs of the mining and the waste disposal are so high with nuclear, it doesn't make any sense. Even though when the plants are running right, they're highly efficient and don't, you know, put out any carbon dioxide. So we have to think about how we get our energy. And so I mentioned Greta Thunberg. People respond to things because it hits our pocketbook, quite frankly, the most. And that's what's going to change our conversation, I believe, on renewable energy as industry invests more and more, and it is, and the prices are going down for alternative kinds of energy. Wind power is already cheaper, solar's getting there. Once we kind of have the battery storage figured out, then no one's going to invest in coal because it's going to be too expensive. Not only that, but it's, of course, causing our climate to warm up. So I kind of want to just spend a couple minutes talking about forest collaboration. And Dave mentioned I was part of 4 forest collaborations. The oldest one is the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition. And it got started by Tim Coleman, who I mentioned was at Earth First with me, and Dwayne Vaughan, who owns Vaughan Brothers Mill, having a conversation back in 2002 to see if we could figure something out. He said, so if we stayed out of the roadless area and you guys got some wilderness, could we get a certain amount of acres of small diameter trees? And we thought, that's a good conversation starter. And so 17 years later, as my friend Bob Whitaker says, the log yards are full. And we have done projects, and we've always, you know, monitored and vetted those projects, and Vaughan Mills has shifted over to using smaller diameter trees, as small as 3-inch on top of the tree. And they're getting the cut is coming out, and the log yards are full on this forest. And on the Panhandle, a similar collaboration, the Panhandle Forest Collaboration. Part of that deal, and that's why collaborations work, is balance. And so early on, they said, oh, you'll get your wilderness, and then you'll just leave. Well, 17 years later, they've got their logs, we haven't got our wilderness. So we're having a lot of discussions about that now and trying to figure out how do we move forward, because otherwise people are going to go, including me possibly, are going to go, why am I helping keep their log yards full and we haven't got that balance of protected lands. So that remains a very interesting issue with all these forest collaborations. And I'm going to be speaking actually the week after this to the National Association of Counties, and I'm on a panel with Curtis Vaughan, Dwayne's son, and I'll be talking about Mill Creek A to Z, and I'll also be talking about balance. And I want to hear those other county commissioners, I want them to listen to that too. I'll also be talking about our open meadow concept, because some of these people a lot of them are ranchers, county commissioners, and we'll talk about if we work together, we might be able to solve your forage problem and the wolf problem. If we don't work together, someone's probably going to sue you down the road. Probably won't be us, but they might, and then you'll be out of the national forest. So Mill Creek A to Z, proof is a little bit in the pudding. We've monitored things. One of the most important things is don't mess up all the creeks. So here's a photo. This was monitored the day after they got an inch of rain right near a logging site, and it's crystal clear. They're being very protective, doing the right work, I believe, up there. And so I can stand by the Mill Creek A to Z story. And we're starting a second one near Chewelah, and we're going to do the same careful no gaping clear cuts, not all this crazy road building, and keep a close watch on what's being taken out of there. No cutting trees over 21 inches. That's what we've all agreed on. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've talked about enough, I think. And questions? Yeah.
I drove over Sherman Pass recently and was absolutely shocked at how horrible it looks.
Yeah.
But then we come down, we camped in Kettle Falls along the river there, and it was gorgeous. What's happening in Sherman Pass? Is that the bark beetle or something that's causing that?
Yeah, well, there's two things. They went up and did a logging project up there, and I think they took too many trees. The bark beetle has definitely hit up there. And that's part of what's going on our forest with climate-wise. Lodgepole pine are susceptible, very susceptible, especially as they get older. The last biggest fires in that region were 80 years ago, and so they're dying off.
It looks like it's prime right now for a fire.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of areas, same with Lookout Pass. Drove over there the other day. A lot of die-off. This is a challenge. I mentioned we're so good at putting out forest fires. We have to do something in place of forest fires. If it's real wildland, I don't want to see any logging, but we do need to get some prescribed fire back on the landscape, because otherwise we are managing these forests. They're getting hotter and hotter. The bark beetles can, overwinter nowadays because of climate is rising. And if we keep thinking we can do nothing, we've got to get fire back onto the forest. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it seems I remember in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of the tree spiking and monkey wrenching types of activities were going on. And I just was thinking kind of circular, okay, were people injured, or were there any incidents where anyone was killed as a result of any of that activity?
What I recall is that a mill worker was injured, seriously injured in California when he was working on a log line and it hit a tree, and a saw hit a tree spike. But I don't remember anyone dying.
Okay.
But obviously, if you do something like put a metal rod in a tree where there's going to be humans around, you're doing something reckless.
But then, moving forward to now, where actual survival of mammals and other life forms is really becoming very undeniably, for most rational people, it's becoming very undeniably real and critical. And so, I just know some people like to frame things as, well, we value life. And so it just seems like, especially the teenager from...
Yeah, Greta.
Yeah, that, that's a very valid and necessary way for this to be framed, because we're perhaps even beyond that tipping point, and it just seems like those tactics that were used previously, it's like, it's really come to be it is a life and death issue now.
Yeah, and I think the people who are trying to shut down the Dakota pipeline and the people who try to get in the way of, I'm surprised there hasn't people just going in and trying to shut down coal-fired plants. Kind of surprises me, because coal is still like a third of our emissions. And they're still building coal plants in some countries. But I have that radio show, and I was referring to a story that, Greta inspired so many kids around the world. There's 123 countries that have now had student strikes, including countries like India that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so that's the hope. She kind of says, if you adults want to get involved, please do. But if not, stand aside. She's pretty amazing. And I think we need that. It's a crisis, and we need that. I agree. Yeah.
Is there any progress right now with the proposed Newport smelter in terms of getting it to not happen? Or is it?
Yeah. Let me talk about that for a second, because that's a great topic of there's two main problems with the Newport smelter. Its air emissions, proposed air emissions are, unacceptable, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, and then its location is right outside the town of Newport, and so if you live near there, you'd be seeing these towers. The other thing, though, to think about is, if we're gonna have solar panels, where are we gonna make the silicon metal? Do we make it in China and let them suffer from it all? And so what I propose is that there is a technology to completely clean up their nitrous oxide, and they can use biochar, activated charcoal, instead of coal, which is insane to use coal, and they could get rid of all the sulfur dioxide. So technologically, they could do it. I don't think they'll ever do it because it won't pencil out for them. What I predict is they won't get permits, and they may back away even before then, because the whole thing was based on very cheap electricity. And the location originally was going to be right by the Kalispell tribal headquarters, and the Kalispels had enough clout to get it moved, but then it got moved to some property right on the edge of Newport. There's better places for that, but where would be a better place? Would you want it in downtown Spokane? We have the steam plant, we don't mind that. If it was, some air blowing out of there that was totally pure, maybe that wouldn't be a big deal, since we do want to have solar panels. But as it is, I think it'll die. And I think if it's going to have pollutants coming out of it, we'll fight it at the Lands Council. And we've submitted comments, and I've met with ecology about it.
Weren't they saying too that it was going to pollute the watershed and it would even filter down into the Little Spokane and the Spokane River?
Yeah, I think the water issue is pretty easy for them to solve, actually. Those kind of smelters don't use that much water. So I think they could solve that one pretty easily. It's the air that really can get into, it can kill lichen way up in the mountains, and it can do serious damage.
So explain the science with the silicon solar panel connection, Jimmy?
So that plant would make silicon metal from quartz, basically. The quartz would come down from some mines near Golden, BC. And then to turn it into silicon metal, you have to smelt it. You have to heat it up. You don't actually burn the coal, but you kind of use pyrolysis, so it heats up the quartz so that it melts enough, and then it turns into silicon metal. Silicon metal is not only in solar panels, it's in, anybody got a phone on them and those sort of things. It's in a lot of our products, and so we could stop using all that stuff, or we could clean up the waste stream, which is the air that comes out of those stacks, and deal with, if there's water issues or any toxic issues. And to rail coal in from Kentucky, I think they'll never do that, I guarantee that. But they might rail in coal from somewhere closer, which would be even worse, because it's higher in sulfur.
About the PCBs, with the inks, and how that kind of created that second problem, is the PCB toxicity as significant or even worse than when the ink is used in the first place with the printing processes, or is it pretty much the same on the back end when it's been recycled in the discharge in the water, or what? How does that work?
Yeah, so PCBs there's multiple types of them, and the more chlorine atoms they have stuck on them, they become almost like dioxin. And they're extremely toxic on nerve systems, and they've done tests at extremely low levels. They bioaccumulate in fat. And so the issue is that we could, PCBs are in titanium dioxide, and we brush our teeth and wipe it on our skin. Those are probably not harming us. It's when although putting on your skin, that kind of freaks me out a little bit, but because it's a great sunscreen thing. But when you have fish and they're in the water, they're eating bugs, it starts bioaccumulating, and they find these higher levels in the fish. And one of the main opponents rightfully about having PCBs get into our river is that the Spokane tribe has very stringent water quality standards. 1 part per quadrillion. It's an extremely low number. That's like throwing a dollar bill out in the state of Washington somewhere and then looking for it. It's a very low amount, and yet it has impacts on fish and humans that eat that fish because it bioaccumulates. And it's in the orcas. And so we've got to figure out ways to get this stuff out of our water. And it doesn't break down. It just barely doesn't break down. Our fungi project was interesting. We'd done a study or review of studies, and one in Eastern Europe showed that certain types of fungi, forest-type fungi, like oyster mushrooms, can actually break down PCBs. And so we've gone through one phase, and it showed it did break down the PCBs. It didn't break them down all the way, and we are testing further to see why that was. Maybe we didn't give it long enough. And the kids at North Central, they have the best science lab in the state for sure, maybe the country. It's amazing, and their teacher. So it's really fun working with them, and it's kind of going to go on for years and years. And eventually, I mean, you're not going to have like mushrooms sitting in water and dissolving, and it takes too long. But for brownfield sites, you should be able to spread it around like Kaiser, and it's leaking in from Kaiser, and it's leaking in from the old GE plant. So if we can find an effective and reasonable way to break them down, at least in dirt, then we can start doing things like pump our stormwater into these, instead of just directly in the river, into these wetlands that they're thinking of. And eventually we'll ratchet down the PCBs. But those are new sources that are in dyes. They're not like the old transfer. They're being created every time you have high temperature and chlorine in new products. Yeah.
Can you talk about some of the impacts of the public land use policy changes in the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Federal policies.
We've lost a lot of our national monuments. Bears Ears, Gold Butte, the Escalante have just been chopped. And it was, quite frankly, a handout to the oil and gas industry so they could go in there and start going after these areas. We've seen attempts to go into the Arctic and drill. They haven't worked yet, but what my fear is, if we can't change the executive branch, the more the years go by, the more we're going to start losing our rules and our land. And so it was a good change, in my opinion. The House flipped over, so at least there's a little bit more balance to stopping laws and stopping regulations. But the administration, I mean, we've had some of the, first we had the flashy politicians, Scott Pruitts of the world, and they were so mouthy that they were getting in trouble. And now we have the kind of secondary administrators who come from deep in the industry and know how to get things done, relax regulations. So every year that goes by, I'm feared that we're going to have, more lax regulations. They've taken away some of the wetlands rule. It's going to impact us for a long time, especially if we don't turn it around in 2020. Yeah.
I have a question. I live near a county, it's a wetlands and a wildlife refuge for like raptors and whatnot. And there's noxious weeds. And I have a neighbor who is Roundup, and I hate using those chemicals on, he calls them up and said, you gotta get out there and destroy all the weeds. I'd rather see something else happen. I'm really worried about the glyphosate, and it's cumulative. They've had court cases, but still. But how do you deal with that? Because there is a law that we have to do away with all the noxious weeds.
Yeah, and they're really tough in wetlands. There's two ways, of course. You can actually hand pull, and they do some of that in the Pend Oreille River. You can hand pull weeds, and that eliminates the chemistry problem.
Like at the national park, control burns.
Yeah.
Do like a control, the right time
Yeah.
of year.
Some weeds, like reed canary grass, is actually considered noxious, and it's choking a lot of our creeks. I don't want to think we should even start pouring glyphosate on there, Roundup, but on the other hand, we should be pulling it Some people have said, well, maybe you can have goats or something. I mean, nothing is perfect, but persistent, like you do it in your own yard, right? Hopefully none of you are using Roundup in your own yard because you actually can manage pulling the weeds yourself and dealing with them. I've had some knapweed in my alley, even though I live right in town, and it's crazy, but I just pull it.
Too bad you can't put it into a fuel.
Well,
Make it into
if you could collect it,
a bio,
if you could collect it in a practical way, you could do something like that.
something with it, yeah.
Because weeds grow great. The other thing is shading. So we're trying to plant a lot of trees at the Lands Council because eventually you will shade out weeds. Most noxious weeds don't do very well in the shade. So getting trees grown is really important for many reasons, actually. Yeah. Dave?
I'm just curious, the lady who had the bomb put under the seat of the car, did they find out who did it?
They never found out who did it.
What's the suspicion?
There was suspicion the FBI did it, but there was never evidence. She had ruffled feathers, a lot of feathers, you know, within industry too, so it's very hard to say. At first they tried to say, well, she put it under her seat, and it's like, well, if she was building a bomb, which she was always a very nonviolent person, she probably wouldn't put it under her seat. So that was never discovered. And then she passed away from cancer a number of years ago, actually. Judy Berry, yeah.
Did you first have lawyers to spring you guys, or how, were you that organized?
We didn't really have lawyers, and we never really got funded either. It was kind of drain savings account wherever we could. We had one guy, Lloyd Clayton, who would donate some money to some of the radical stuff, and he was a great Southerner. But very few and far between, and we just didn't have attorneys. Now, we do have pro bono attorneys these days who, like the Western Environmental Law Center does some great work, and Earth Justice does a lot of great work, but we never tapped in on those lawyers. We kind of just did our day in court. Yep.
Any big plans for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day next year?
No, but it'd be fun to work on something. Maybe we'll do another hoax that would be really meaningful. Let's all be creative about this, because sometimes those things work. But no, it's great to think what 50 days has done. We've kind of shifted away at the Lands Council. Instead of kind of just having a couple tables at a fair where everyone hands out stuff, we plant trees. So we planted hundreds of trees this year at Saltese Flats. And I think a day of service to the earth is really important to do. Yeah.
There was a letter by Mary Neighbor in the paper, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and it was about planting trees all over Spokane, and it had to do with, why are you planting trees that are susceptible to that beetle?
Right.
And what is your take on that? What should we be planting that isn't susceptible to the beetle?
Yeah, I saw that. And ponderosa pine actually aren't that susceptible. Lodgepole certainly are, and white bark pine are. They're little different trees. And you'll see ponderosa pine with needles falling or turning brown. You see that. That's normal. That does happen. Ponderosa pine are the best tree in a lot of ways because they're so native to this area and very drought resistant. And so if you had to pick a tree that was probably going to do okay in climate change, ponderosa pine's a pretty good one. In fact, it's predicted that the other species, like the fir species and spruce certainly, is going to just keep moving up in elevation and north in latitude because they're not going to do so well in the as our climate warms. There are some good trees out there. Western larch, if you water it at first, it should catch on in Spokane. And you don't see very many of them around here, but they're very resilient to fire and they need a lot of sun. So they're a great tree. And they'll get some mistletoe on them after a while, but that's when they're pretty old. So I'm still a big fan of ponderosa pine.
But they don't get the beetle, huh?
Oh, there's numerous types of beetle. They can get some beetles and some disease, but they're pretty strong. And they're very fire resistant too. And what used to happen was, I was just walking along the Spokane River by the Santa Fe Bridge, and you see all these and you'll see this around town, just tons of little ponderosa pine. Well, what would have happened, there would have been fires every 10 to 15 years. Those would have burned out. And you'll even see fire scars on some of the bigger, older ponderosa pine. They can take a fire, a smaller fire. They can't take a raging crown fire. No forest can too well. So we've got to kind of get fire back in, or if it's right around homes, it's a little hard to do that. You just got to remove those, I think. Because you get too much thick, you get ladder fuels, and it can burn up.
Ponderosa pine leaves are supposed to release oxygen. Do ponderosa pine needles release oxygen?
That is a great question. I know as they're growing, they absorb carbon dioxide like any plant. I'm not sure about releasing oxygen. I don't know. I know that I thought I could lay them all over my backyard. I kind of wanted to kill my grass. I thought, well, they'll just be like wood chips. No, they just kind of dissolved in and made great dirt, but they didn't stay on the ground very long. But I don't know about the release oxygen. That's interesting. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the Lake Talk Creek, the follow-up on that article that was in the paper?
Yeah, last Sunday there was an article about the Spokane Trout Unlimited and the Coeur d'Alene tribe doing some restoration work up in Idaho. And there's a lot of concern about Hangman Creek. It used to be like 70 or 80% tree cover, and now it's probably like 5% tree cover. And so what that has happened, people farm up right to the edge of the creek because that's some of the most fertile soil. And there's no buffer requirement on private land. And so the creek just bleeds dirt from everywhere, not just one place. And then all the high flows, because they've straightened out part of it. So the project the Coeur d'Alene tribe did a few years ago on some land they had bought was to kind of have the creek meander again instead of just going straight through this property. And that was a great project. You can actually drive up a road, and it's either on or right near the reservation, and you can see, and they planted trees. And so the idea, trees, shade, water, and putting meanders in slows the energy of the river. And what's happened with all this farming is farmers, and I'm on the board of Farm Power, know some pretty feisty farmers, but I'll call it some intermittent creek, and they'll say it's a ditch. And so for them, you straighten the ditch out so you can get the water off the field so it doesn't, keep your field too wet at certain times of the year. But the long-term solution is have a buffer with trees along the whole, as much of the creek as you can. We have some things we call beaver dam analogs, and it's kind of driving some stakes in the bed of the river and then making like a little beaver dam. Those are really, we've done several. They're great at trapping sediment, and they'll also kind of tend to raise the water level, which will kind of also slow the flow, but also spread it out in the surrounding fields. You got to work with farmers to have them do that. And we're trying to convince some farmers in Hangman that that'd be a good thing to do in their ditches. Because I want to try some in these intermittent creeks to see if that would just raise the groundwater. And I think we probably need to do hundreds of those. So there's a huge amount of work. The Conservation District has got a lot of people that do no-till farming. And so instead of having all these exposed fields that the rains wash into the river, the water drains more into the soil. And it costs some money to switch over, but those are great programs too. And we've probably planted 50,000 trees, I'm guessing, in the Hangman Creek watershed at the Lands Council. So, and we've had to water a lot of them. As it gets drier every summer, turns out you can't just stick them in the ground. And planting's easy, watering's a tough one. So we'll keep doing that. I'm actually pretty worried about this spring. I mean, it's sort of stopped raining. What's going on? It's May. If it doesn't rain much anymore, we're going to have a lot of problems. Yeah. Yeah.
How much pollution is British Columbia contributing to the Columbia River?
Well, of course, for years, which I think Tech used to be called Tech Kamiko, they had that mill up there, and they would first, the company before them would just dump it in the river. And now even though it might be on the shore of the river, it still flows into the river. The Celgar pulp mill also had a lot of pollution, probably a lot of PCBs coming into the river. It's less than it was, but there's a huge legacy. You know, just like we have a legacy here out of the Coeur d'Alene Basin of they used to dump the stuff right in the river, and then they put it on the shore, and then it rained and got in the river, or the groundwater came through. So the Columbia is even worse. I would say that I've never heard, but I could well bet all the contaminated soil behind Cooley Dam was probably far worse than what's in Lake Coeur d'Alene, because they use a lot of chemicals up there. And there's lead and some of the same elements that we have here. So I'm hope that this Columbia River Treaty gets done to accommodate some of the pollution that comes down, as well as, you know, the discussion between Canada and the U.S. about dam flows and water rights. And the tribes, the Colville tribe is a big part of those discussions. It needs to be. Yeah.
So the legacy pollution from mines, from all of this, it always confounds me when I read about, you know, another mining project going through the processes, whether it's in the cabinets or, you know, some other
Bunker Hill,
transportation of
right.
Bunker Hill.
Yeah.
You know, how is it when we have federal laws? I mean, this is more hypothetical because look at the administration's actions, but I mean, we're supposed to have laws where polluters pay, and it would seem to me logical to make those polluters clean up their stuff before permits are granted for yet another version of the same legacy pollution, 150 years on, you know?
Yeah, for example, I'm fairly familiar with the companies got fined, I think almost $500 million for cleanup, but the cleanup is going to cost so much more than $500 million. The lake right now, how are you going to deal with that? If it turns over and starts putting those metals, and they're lead and arsenic are the main metals of concern, back into the water, we're in a mess even down here in Spokane River. And yet the idea that you could dredge that out somehow, that would cost so much money, or cap it with something that wouldn't. We've created a mess. And then to allow Bunker Hill or the Rock Creek mine in Montana, which is egregious because it's over it's underneath a wilderness area, but they did lose their latest round at least. That's why you need, you know, vigilant groups like Western Environmental Law Center and Earth Justice, because our laws are there, but it worries me that people are getting appointed to courts who are very conservative and they're very pro-mining. We also have an 1872 mining law, which means you don't have to pay any royalties if you get any mineral off of federal lands, no royalties, and that was 1872. And so there's some effort to try and get that going again in legislation. But yeah, there's some very unjust things, absolutely. On that happy note, but there's good things going on, and collaborative work has made some progress. We aren't cutting down old growth trees on the Colville or the Panhandle anymore. They haven't gone into roadless areas there in a couple decades, so keep some hope.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mike. That was great. Appreciate you taking the time to come and address our group. Vicki?
I have a question for Mike. What time does the Earth Matters broadcast on KYRS?
Oh, great question. It's at noon on Tuesdays,
Thank you.
and it's an hour show now, and it's in town it's 88.1, no, out of town it's 88.1, and in town it's 92.3 FM.
Well, if I can have your attention for 5 more minutes, then we'll adjourn. Some of our members are passing a handout down each of the rows. If you would take one and pass it down. We want to talk a little bit about our PEG organization, and this handout has 2 sides to it. And so one is on PEG, and on the flip side, there's some information on the Commonwealth Club of California. How many of you have heard of the Commonwealth Club of California? Okay. So about half of you have. The Commonwealth Club of California is a model that PEG is aspiring to. The Commonwealth Club was started in 1903 in the Bay Area of California, and it's become a very influential organization, certainly in the state of California and the Bay Area, but even on a national basis. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to become just like the Commonwealth Club in this area, and we hope we can shorten their learning curve of 115 years, maybe to 20 years here. So we're at a point where we've carefully organized. You'll see when you read through the document that we're getting ready to incorporate as a 501c3, and we hope to start to grow the organization. This is our 9th forum. We started, the organization started in July of 2017. We had our first forum in April of 2018, and this is our 9th forum. But we're now ready to start committee work. And so one of the committees, you'll see on that document that we've listed 4 or 5 areas that we're going to have committees on. One is the environment. We'd like to have a committee on health care and one on education and social services, et cetera, et cetera. So we're getting ready to start. We want to start our committee work, and we're trying to increase our membership. So if you're interested in either becoming a member or working on one of our committees, we'd like you to reach out to the club. And so my name, number, phone number, and email's on there. And then Barb Kerr, Barb, raise your hand. Her name and email is on there. We'd sure appreciate it if you get in touch with us. We'd love to start growing our membership and start our committee work. And by the way, if you have a committee or an area that you're passionate about or that you're interested in and want to start a committee, we're open to that. And so what we really want to do is we want to do what the Commonwealth Club has done in California, and that's they've become influential in the development of public policy, and that's what we would like to do. So I'll just use the Environmental Committee as an example. We'd like to get that started, and what we want to do is help organizations like the Lands Council reach their goals. You know, every organization, whether it's the Lands Council or it's a healthcare organization, they never have enough time and enough resources to accomplish everything they want to do. So I've talked to Mike. We'd like to help them reach some of their goals that they don't have the time and resources to work on. And so when we formed that committee, Mike has said he would come and help us get that committee off the ground. We're going to try to do the same thing in these other areas like social services, healthcare. Barb said she wants to start a history committee, history and social studies committee. So if you have an interest, we're getting ready to grow the organization. We'd sure like to hear from you and help spread the word. So no more forums now until September. We take the summer off as the weather gets nicer, but the forums will restart in September. So any questions before I adjourn for tonight?
Regarding the environmental issue, does anybody address the geoengineering that is happening?
There are some climate groups that look into that a bit. You're talking about putting particles in the air and doing that sort of thing to try to avoid, But I don't know of any local groups who are specifically working on that. I just don't know of any, but I'm sure there's some national groups that are. I'll try to ask Brian Henning at 350.org if he's got anybody in mind for that.
So do you collect dues? Are you looking at boots on the ground to help some of the other organizations that are already doing this work, or is it more financial assistance, or what? I mean, what form does this take? Your
Good question. So, again, we believe we've structured the organization to where we want to be. We're forming a 501c3 so that we can start to collect. We're going to do a fundraiser. You'll see that's on the list, and not probably for another 2 years, but then contributions to the organization will be tax deductible. Membership as this time is $60 a year or $5 a month. That's just to keep the organization running. The committee work, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to duplicate efforts. So I use the Lands Council as an example. They have projects. I'm sure you never have enough time or money to get every project handled. So what we would like to do, the way we would like to get started in working on public policy in several different areas is go to organizations like the Lands Council and say, what can we do to help you reach your goals that are in line with our mission? And if you read our mission, PEG's mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing which are fiscally responsible and ensure a social safety net and promote a civil society. And our goal on the back page is to influence public policy that advances our mission. So we're not going to, probably advocate Earth First type activities, but Mike's doing a lot of collaborative work now on these forest projects. And so those types of things, or the Hingman Creek project, we would be interested in helping.
Okay, so other groups like, that would have a similar mission to what you're interested in, and that's the, like the League of Women Voters. I mean, you're not trying to recreate the wheel. And
We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to, we don't see ourselves as identical to the League of Women Voters, but not, we would consider them a sister organization. Julie, can I pick on you? So in the back row, I asked Julie Hoenkamp to come tonight. Julie's the executive director of SNAP. And so I asked her to come tonight because we'd like to do some work on social services area. And so I'm sure Julie's organization has projects that, again, lack of time and resources. We'd like to help. So that's how we see us getting off the ground, is forming committees that can help existing organizations with projects to further their projects down the road. Does that make sense?
When will these meetings start,
As soon as you contact us. So our membership meetings, we meet the first Wednesday of every month, Wednesday mornings at 7:30. Now, I know that's early for some people, but we have people on the committee members who work, and so that we want to get started early so they can still get to work in a reasonable time.
when do you meet?
What's that?
Where do you meet?
Right now, we meet at members' homes, but rooms like this are always available.
Yeah.
So, we use the libraries a lot. You've probably noticed. Okay, any other questions? And by the way, you're welcome to come to meetings without committing. We tell this to people all the time. You can kind of ease into this. So if you want to come and visit a couple meetings, you don't have to pay dues. You don't have to sign up for anything. You can come and check it out and see if this is for you. So again, our goal is to do what the Commonwealth Club has done, and we hope to do it in 20 years. It took them 115. But, we can learn from what they did. All right, well, thank you all for coming tonight. Have a good rest of the night.